I'm back with another interview show, this time about CSGO custom maps. It's Hammer Meet Anvil, and with me, joining me for the inaugural episode, is poLemin. He's been releasing maps for CSGO since 2013, and he's best known for Manor during the 2017 MapCore Face-It mapping contest, Feast for his placement in the Exotic Places contest that was a bit more recent, and the most recent map that he's released is Guard for the Wingman mapping contest. So he joins me now, having released 3 relatively high-profile maps, and he's currently a level designer for Bongfish. How you doing, man?
Pretty good, thank you. How are you?
Pretty good. So when I wanted to have you on, one of the reasons why is because back in the day when the mapping contest for the Exotic Places setup was still fresh in everybody's mind, one of the things that I was very interested in is sort of piercing the shroud as far as level design goes, with an emphasis on functional and readable layouts. And for those who are uninitiated, I imagine most people who are going to be watching this aren't necessarily fully inculcated to the culture of custom maps in CSGO. I personally play a lot of them, and generally I would say I play more custom levels than I do regular official levels. And one of the things that I always like to see is a bit of a callback to the older style, maybe even going as far back as to say like 1.6 style levels, in terms of just generally like lower on the sense of clutter, not having too much stuff in the middle of the map visually distracting you. Of course, something that everybody can get behind, even if they've only played official maps, is at some points, especially with the skins that came out, that was a big deal last year. You know, there's things that impact readability in Counter-Strike, and Counter-Strike is a big game for readability's sake. So we definitely want to maximize that when we're talking about levels, custom or otherwise. And one of the main things that I really appreciated about Feast, which was your entry into the Exotic Places contest, is that it essentially had this very functional layout. It did some things that we hadn't seen done in quite the same orientation before. And especially the fact that at every stage of the game, in pretty much every area, I didn't have visibility problems. I knew exactly where to pick out. Like, there was a good balance of which operators or which like player models you picked for each side. Mm-hmm. And we can get into about like the decision-making process behind all of this stuff. But firstly, I wanted to ask you about how you end up avoiding the issues that some Counter-Strike level designers do have when it comes to designing a level and then somehow like suddenly, oh, there's too much stuff on screen, I've got to pull back, I got to scale back. What's your process for avoiding that sense of like really tough visibility issues that sometimes can plague CSGO levels, custom or otherwise?
Well, the obvious answer would be playtesting a lot to begin with. That's a big one. Apart from that, I also I played Counter-Strike semi-professionally, so I kind of have an eye for stuff like that. It bothers me instantly when I see it, and I kind of want to fix it right away. Just focusing on the player experience, not have them frustrated, because there are so many maps out there. If my map is frustrating the player, they'll just put it to the side and go to the next one and play something different. And I kind of want to avoid that and make it as comfortable for the player as possible.
Well, that's a big deal too, because workshop discoverability, especially in the middle of last year, and especially going back further, there's of course a lot of like workshop skin scams that were happening, and like a crazy amount of stuff that was being like propelled to the front page via bots and stuff. So even bearing that to one side and just considering the fact that there are a lot of level designers out there making maps, and there's a decent number of people who are looking to play these maps, one of the things that I've always found interesting is when you boot up a map and, you know, it immediately sort of has that welcoming vibe where it's not even necessarily that the map has to be like sunny and colorful, but just that the idea is that there was some logic put into the initial stages of the level where you're spawning in either T or CT, and you almost know like, oh, this is instinctually where I should go, like on a base level, and that is something that you really can't get without an eye for that sort of thing. Like you're talking about playing semi-professionally, it gives you, especially when you're conceptualizing it from the perspective of a level designer, you start to think about it like, how do I make this play as well as all of the maps that I've played as a pro, or how do I make this play as the best maps that I played as a pro? And coming at it from that perspective, I'm sure that helped you a lot with testing. Now, you mentioned that you do extensive play testing. What does the process look like for that? Do you have like an in-group that you bring up with 5v5s? Do you do a lot of bot games? Like, how does that look for you?
So for starters, I'll just boot up the map with bots as soon as I have the general layout done, and the enough mesh generation can happen in a reasonable manner. So I'll test with bots first, then I'll sometimes bring in a couple of friends who I play Counter-Strike with regularly, but also like to get fresh eyes on it pretty soon. And therefore, I used playtesting capabilities of the map core community. We have like a bunch of people who organize playtests every week, multiple times, and the general procedure is to have the initial playtest, the very first playtest, as a 10 versus 10, just to get the timings somewhat right, or like major bugs or stuff like that ironed out right away. And then a more detailed 5 versus 5 competitive setting with like teams split into 2 teams of 5, or the players split into two teams of 5, duking it out. Yeah, and the feedback coming from the mapping community is very important too, since like it's not only players that are important, but also like you have to keep in mind all of the design decisions, that they make sense, and also technical stuff like performance and stuff like that. So I always try to have a wide array of different people with different backgrounds to test my levels in order to make the best product possible.
Well, that's a big part about keeping things welcoming and, essentially stopping them from being frustrating, like you were talking about earlier. For anybody who boots up a map and their performance almost immediately tanks, that's a pretty big, red flag for them, and they might not even complete a full playtest, or just they may be discouraged from continuing. So when it comes to performance side of things, I mean, CSGO is a tricky, Source Engine, more broadly speaking, is a tricky thing to get around. What is your process generally for, like, if you boot up a map and you're playtesting and you have this 10 versus 10 environment, which means that you've got the maximum possible sample size for, generally speaking, a playable, game. You've got reports coming in from all over the place, depending on whether or not they have performance issues or if they were fine. And you might ask them for their hardware or whatever. What's your process generally when it comes time to look at the data and you find out that, oh, there's FPS drops in this area or anything like that? Have there been areas in Feast or Guard more recently that you've had to deal with that sort of thing? Or, I mean, I imagine Guard is probably easier because it's a smaller map, but so targeting specifically Feast, were there any issues there where you had problems trying to keep the FPS manageable, or did you have some strategy before you even got to that point that made sure that you were basically not in any danger of having performance problems?
I generally never had major problems with optimization, gladly. I try to optimize before having a playtest anyway. Like I try to optimize the map, so we don't even run into issues like that, because that can compromise an entire playtest. Like if people cannot play on a side because it's super laggy, then the playtest is basically useless. So I'm trying to keep FPS reasonably high at all stages of the map.
Do you have any particular tricks up your sleeve as far as how you design the bomb sites, or how you design the certain, like the areas where there's going to be the most action, presumably, are especially the ones that you want to keep FPS the highest? Is there a particular process that you use, or some sort of like principles you have to stand by when it comes to the design phase of those things, of those areas of the map, that helps keep performance in check?
Yeah, there are a few things that you can do, and one of them is adding a lot of negative space, like larger buildings between combat areas to separate those so they're not both rendered at the same time. I like shy away from stuff like fences where you can jump over or see through even in the layout, partly because of optimization issues.
One of the things that I'm super curious about personally, and without getting too much into detail about the things that you're currently working on a professional level, I wanted to ask about comparisons between Source Engine and some of the other engines of the games that are out there that people generally make FPS level design for. What's your take on, generally speaking, Source Engine? Like, if you had to say, like, you're sort of trying to give it a rating in your mind, like, how does it compare to other engines out there that you've used or that you're using currently? And what are its like major, if you had to like say best trait and worst trait or something in that sense? If you have a couple, you can also give those.
Yeah, generally I have like a little soft spot for the Source engine and Hammer itself. I feel like Hammer is a very, very good tool in terms of prototyping, gray blocking, quickly dishing something out, and presenting and playtesting it. Where the engine does lack, though, is art workflow, which is a little bit tedious because you need a lot of third-party tools to convert your models into usable models in the engine. Same goes for materials and stuff like that. Everything you have to have another program open in order to make assets for the map itself.
So it's basically it's not centralized as far as the art flow goes. Like it,
exactly. Like in Unreal Engine, for example, you have a BSP editor where you can mesh out like geometry. You also have a material editor where you can build your own shaders and stuff like that. And Source, it's like every part of this map creation has a different program attached to it.
Yeah, personally, that sounds like a nightmare. I don't know how you do it. So one of the things that I was going to jump off of to this point is comparing essentially like the current ladder maps that you have in the right now, obviously like the most recent edition, which is a long time ago now, is Vertigo. I wanted to get your thoughts a little bit on that particular map because as you know, we talked before the interview, you said that you follow a decent amount of professional play. You've said earlier in this interview, you used to play at a semi-professional level as well, which indicates that you have some sort of eye for like not only what makes a good professional map, but also how professionals can use certain features. I wanted to get your take on the trying to reverse engineer the design philosophy of Vertigo and of the Valve developers who are working on Vertigo. Because to me, and again, as more of a layman when it comes to Counter-Strike, I don't know that much about the process of building a Counter-Strike map, but I do know a decent amount about level design more broadly in a theoretical level. And so I don't know what challenges they were facing that, like you're saying, you're elucidating here, like, oh, you know, everything is its own program and all that stuff. So surely they had some technical challenges, but one of the things that is a little bit harder for me to parse is the fact that like some of the Vertigo changes just seemed like they didn't make sense. And I wanted to get your take on like, there's been so many revisions in the past, even just the past year, the past calendar year. And some of them have been for good and some of them have been for bad. Is there a particular like design philosophy that you can get behind there, especially considering, again, this is a map that's in the competitive pool that's deciding careers potentially or certainly influencing them at a professional level? How do you think Valve has handled Vertigo, generally speaking?
I think they handled it pretty well, actually. It was, well, maybe not in the beginning. It was a little bit rushed when it came into the game and then into the professional circuit. But they gave it basically the same treatment as Overpass, where the map was kind of a dumpster fire when it came out and like was introduced into the professional scene. But then step by step improved more and more. And something I noticed with Vertigo is that I feel like it's just a theory, but I feel like they had the idea of bringing something new to the table, a new type of layout, but also kind of resurrecting the old baby, the old Vertigo map, and kind of like stay true to some of the design principles from back then. And you can see like a lot of the geometry in the level still looks the same as it did in 1.6 even. And then there are a few design decisions that kind of rub me the wrong way. Like the ladder room feels like a major afterthought. It's very like claustrophobic and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I understand the idea behind it, but I feel like that is one of the smaller design elements in that map that kind of bother me.
More recently, I think they've added some sort of corridor rotation between the lower B platform that goes up to the stairs and that ladder room that you're talking about. And that I feel like on a personal level, that seems to accentuate that flaw that you're talking about, where okay, they need a shortcut between these two areas, and they also need a way to get mid control without having to go through the one passageway to mid on T side. So in a sense, I feel like map makers generally are balancing between what is good for map flow and what a professional circuit would look like or would look to. And in the case of Vertigo, those two changes to me feel like, okay, we've got a situation where Vertigo needs these changes in order to be a map that has a decent number of opportunities for both teams. But at the same time, if you have a situation where you're only doing that as a band-aid fix to enable that, the flaw then becomes that maybe they don't fit the map flow in an objective sense. They do improve the tactical options, but at what cost, essentially? So I wanted to connect this over to the B-bomb site as well, because just throughout Vertigo's recent history in the competitive ladder, it's been one of those bomb sites that's often called, like, it's just the forgotten child, and everybody's going to the A side. A lot of the fighting happens to A. Sometimes you'll see action mid. Sometimes you'll see people threatening towards B. Initially, I thought this was going to play out somewhat like Inferno does, where people threaten banana, they want to hold banana control, and then they can do a dangerous pivot. Like, I'm always holding this over you. As the T side, I can always decide I'm going to charge it into B, and if you don't have people in there, we're going to catch you off guard. I thought that was going to be the way that Vertigo played out, but it seems like more often than not, while sometimes the threat is there, a lot of pro teams simply pivot to A for the most part. So for one, would you agree with the assessment that B seems to be lackluster? And for another, regardless of your personal feelings on the B side, do you think that you see a way to improve just how it flows into the rest of the map, or how the rest of the map flows into it?
I think, so I haven't seen too many matches on the most recent revision, to be honest. But I think that the site itself suffers a little bit from the window that was there in previous revisions being removed, because it was kind of built around that. Like, the balancing was built around that. It became an issue, so they fixed it. But now it's like you only have one way towards the site and the other one from behind the site, which is open to T-spawn. And it feels a little bit similar to B side on Cobble, actually. Well, that's not quite right, because you can, like, when you go down drop, you can jump through the window, and that will be the equivalent to the new drop in Vertigo.
It would almost be like them removing the window feels to me like it would be like if they were removing the drop entirely from Cobble. So you only have one way in, is what it seems to be in a sense. Like, you've got the rotation from CT, and then you've got the way to go out the long area onto that site, and otherwise you've got nothing without drop. And in that sense, I think it's fair to say that the window there between the box cutout there, that was a way for mid control to pivot towards B, certainly would help in theory. So one of the things that B on Vertigo generally seems to also have is, like, they've shifted the cover on that site a ton. In this sense, they're mostly targeting the site itself after obviously messing around with the window and removing it. Well, I guess they moved it to a different part of the middle now, but it's pretty much CT side. Like, it's very close to CT. So do you think that this is the developers looking for ways to improve the gunplay on the site itself without taking into account the approaches? Because of course the approaches to the bomb site are sometimes even more important than the bomb site itself. What do you think on that?
That's a difficult question, to be honest. I'm not 100% sure which problems the previous window opposed. So I'm not entirely sure why they removed it and moved it further back towards CT mid. It makes sense, because once you remove it, you need another access route towards the B side. But the exact reason why they would remove it is not entirely clear to me, to be honest.
Well, that is one of the things that I think Valve would benefit from, and the community in general would benefit from, is giving some sort of reasoning as to why they make the changes that they make. And this goes beyond just mapping, but especially when it comes to mapping, if we could figure out who the lead level designer is on Vertigo currently, assuming it's even the same person every single time, it would be very elucidating. It would be very informative to have them say, hey, here's why I've decided to make these changes. Maybe they could open up a dialogue with some of the pro players and figure out, like, hey, pro players, what do you think is wrong with with the site and or with the map in general. And you got to take that with a grain of salt too, because sometimes pro players have crazy ideas, or sometimes pro players just haven't thought as deeply as level designers would, which is something we can all just sympathize with. But they will at least give you some information about pain points in that sense. And given the fact that generally Valve is not super forthcoming with information, I was curious about if you've had any talks with some of the level designers who have made custom CSGO maps that have then been accepted into the official ladder pool. Like recently we had Anubis come in, we had Swamp come in, we had Chlorine come in as well. So those ones were from the MapCore Exotic Places contest. Mm-hmm. And I was curious if you had any insight as to what the patch note logic is over there. Like when they do write out their patch notes, sometimes I'll see information like, we did this because, or for the purpose of, and then they'll insert a purpose, like, moved this barrel to improve visibility or something like that. But for the most part, any reasoning you can get, you have to almost infer based on the patch notes. Is this something that, CSGO level designers, more broadly speaking, are also like taking cues from Valve and not really adding that much context to their patch notes? Or do you think that this is almost like an instructive, or what's your take on that?
So from a personal side, I also can say that writing patch notes can be a little bit tedious. You need to keep track of everything you change during the process, and then you also need to like document why exactly you did those changes. Sometimes you moved a box in a revision because, I don't know, there was like a weird head glitch, and then or a head peak, and in the end, when you're done with the revision, you don't even remember why you moved that box to begin with. Stuff like that. It's hard to keep track of, to be honest. And coming back to your question, I don't know if you're aware that for community maps, the patch notes are also written by the community mappers themselves.
Right, yeah. So what I was asking is, like, does it seem like they're taking cues from Valve in that they're not really adding that much context, or do you think that's just a habit that they've built already? Like like you're saying, it's tedious to write these patch notes. So as a community level designer, if you're going in and you're making some changes, especially when you've got to deal with the fact that, it's now being played by thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people, depending on which map it is, and you've got to keep track of all of the feedback that's coming in. Essentially, what do you think the logic is behind when they're writing the patch notes? Could they, in theory, add more context, or is that something that they're just assuming that like maybe it's not necessary?
Well, I, not only as a developer but also as a player, would appreciate some more context for sure. But yeah, as I said, it's hard to keep track of things, or also weigh how important that change actually is in the end. When it comes down to like details, as I mentioned before, with head peaks, for example, do I write in the patch notes I moved that box, or do I write in those patch notes I moved that box because I didn't want head peaks or whatever? And it also gets a little bit longer. People don't want to, like, there are also people who don't want to read patch logs for the rest of the day or so. So I guess the main motivation is give a broad overview of what changed, so everyone's aware and they can interpret it by themselves, basically.
One of the things that you referenced when we were discussing Vertigo is the fact that it seems like Valve wants to have the element that Vertigo offers, which is the crazy amount of fall damage. Obviously, the fact that you can just fall off the map entirely and die. That's one of the characteristics that defined the map for a long time. And one of the things that I'm interested in talking about is ways that maps could potentially be tapping into this kind of thing, where they're introducing a brand new gameplay mechanic. And to illustrate this point, I want to switch gears to talk about Swamp, which is a community map for the Exotic Places contest that obviously most people will probably be familiar with because it's in the game. So Swamp initially, for those who are not in the know, actually shipped with a gameplay defining mechanic where moving through the sludge on the ground, the swamp, would slow you down as you slow your character down in terms of movement. And this made a certain kind of sense based on the map's construction. And when this mechanic was removed, a lot of things had to be revisited because sometimes it was like put into the balance of the map itself. without getting into speculation as to who made the call to remove the change, whether it was like Valve instructing them or if it was just a decision that was made by the level designers themselves, what do you think about the thought process that goes into designing potentially new game mechanics that only certain maps provide? Is this something that we should be exploring specifically with regards to the movement speed slowing, or are there other things that maybe you've thought of that would help set a map apart in a way that feels meaningfully distinct from some of the other maps, but through the use of custom gameplay mechanics, something like Vertigo allowing you to fall to your death where no other map really allows for that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Is that something that you'd be interested in exploring, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great idea. I think stuff like that is really good for the game, really good for the maps themselves too. Like if you would describe Vertigo to someone who has played maybe every map once, you would say it's the one where you can fall off the tower, and they would immediately know what you're talking about. It's not really interfering with the main game mechanics. Like you're not changing gravity, you're not changing gunplay in any kind. It's just you have to be a little bit more aware of your surroundings. Though they also added these little fences on the sides of all of the catwalks, so you can't really. I think there are just a few more spots where you can fall down without jumping, but generally you as a player need to do the action and put yourself into the risk to fall down. In regards to Swamp, I personally did not like the way the mechanic was approached. I'm an advocate for positive reinforcement, giving players unique mechanics to boost their speed, for example. Contra did that in the Contra CS. I think it was in 1.62, but I played it in CSS, and they had like a little canal where you can run through, and in one direction it would be faster. So you could perform faster rotations through that little tunnel, which I think is a great mechanic. I applaud the effort of the makers of Swamp to try out something new. I think it didn't work because it did feel fairly punishing as a player, and did not feel very satisfying in most cases.
There's a more recent community map called Rift, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It's a map that is a hostage rescue map where the rescuing helicopter zones only activate after like a minute of gameplay or something. So one of the things that they do, interestingly enough, related to this discussion, is they have a conveyor belt where if you stand on it, or I think you have to crouch to get through a hole or something, but you can be remaining still, but still moving in a way that you technically are moving while still remaining like at full accuracy. And that could be one potential element that, if this was incorporated in a more broad scale environment to a larger map, maybe a factory themed map or something, you could imagine that could, in theory, benefit an existing or future community level that would set it apart without doing something that's punishing, like you're saying, where either the player is opting into walking on that against the grain and thus going slower, or they're opting in to receive the benefit as well if they're taking it as it's intended. So just it strikes me as odd that there's not as many, at least widely regarded or widely known community maps that have even attempted, let alone stuck with, the idea of changing gameplay mechanics entirely or providing new mechanics. Because I agree that my personal home game is StarCraft 1, which is a game that is basically characterized by not changing. So you don't want to change too much. I'm very familiar with that. And the design philosophy that goes into trying to find ways to make things meaningfully distinct and provide different avenues for expression of skill without contradicting the core mechanics of the game. It's a fine line in certain cases, and you definitely have to be careful about how you tread on that. But I did want to broach the topic with you because I feel like there's a lot of room for that sort of thing. And my next question for you is, what kind of, be they custom mechanics or just different layout choices, what kind of things do you think that the wider spectrum of Counter-Strike community maps have not explored yet that you would like to see? Like, is there a certain kind of level design tenet or sort of design philosophy that you'd like to see explored in Counter-Strike or anything like that?
So generally, maybe like one more point to the previous question. concerning gameplay mechanic changing elements in maps, you should definitely check out some of the entries for the current Wingman contest. People made some crazy shit there. They played around with gravity a little bit. They played around with saw blades. I saw saw blades. Then this conveyor belt rift is one of the maps that is in the entries as well. So definitely keeping an eye out on that is something I would recommend.
Cool.
Yeah, and something I played around with but only in my head. I didn't really prototype anything yet. Are elements where you have some kind of destructible environment, a little bit more to the effect of like vent. What's it called? Like vents, similar to the ones in Mirage, where you can have different gameplay whether the vent is open or it's not. But maybe there could also be elements where maybe it's similar to Chateau actually did something like that, where you have wooden planks over a gap, but you can shoot those wooden planks in the beginning of the round, so people had to jump over that gap and make a sound cue. Stuff like that, I feel like could be explored a little bit more.
I'm searching for the map name right now. I think it was like Saint Gellert or something like that. But there is a map. I'll have it in the description that actually has a way to open up a door by shooting like an explosive barrel or something. And I thought that while it's like a fairly small change, because it's essentially a more explosive version of event where you shoot it or you deal damage to it, and there's now a new way paved for it. It was an interesting take because obviously it's much bigger than event. You know, you can fit like multiple people through that at once instead of it being as claustrophobic. So I definitely think, and I agree with your point, that there's a lot of exploration that people can do with destructible environments and having areas of the map that potentially shift depending on the outcome of certain, player actions that aren't necessarily left clicking on people's heads, which is as central as that is to the game. It's as nice as satisfying as it is to do. Sometimes there's ways to get a positional advantage on your opponent that you might be able to do with something like this. You might be able to open up more paths of expressing a different kind of skill than pure precision. So in keeping with that idea, actually, I wanted to talk about a different sort of design that goes into generally like these smaller maps, because I personally am a big fan of large scale stuff. Every time I play a bot game, it's always like 15 bots on one team or something. Like I try to have like as many people as possible, just because I really like the idea of even though Counter-Strike's gameplay or weapon balance doesn't necessarily suit it. Yeah. I like the idea of large scale battles, and it's quite the opposite approach with this latest contest that's been coming out for Wingman, obviously, where it's 2v2. And I wanted to talk about the difference between even a more reasonable scale, like 5 versus 5, which we're all used to. The differences between designing a map made for 5 people on each team compared to designing a map made for 2 people on each team. And the reason why I feel like this needs to be discussed personally is when the Wingman game mode was initially launched, there weren't Wingman specific maps, right? There was closed off versions of existing maps. And I think that sent a different kind of message than maybe Valve intended to level designers and to people who were just looking there playing in that game mode, that, pretty much any map can be a Wingman map, even if it's designed to be a 5v5 map initially. You just close off one bomb site and you move up the spawns. So what, in your opinion, are the biggest differences between designing for 2 versus 2 compared to 5 versus 5? Obviously, your map Guard, which I played a little bit of recently, has I would say it's bigger than most Wingman maps I've seen, but I haven't played all of the ones that are out there, and yet still seems, in my opinion, to like work in all of the architecture of the level in a satisfying way, despite the fact that it's really only designed for 2 players on each team, and it might initially seem large. So, what are the design philosophies that you've picked up in order to produce a map like Guard compared to the map like Feast?
Yeah, so generally the main difference, or what actually rubs me the wrong way by using 5v5 bomb sites as Wingman maps, is that they're designed to be held by 2 to 3 people against 5, if like at worst case, basically. In a Wingman scenario, you will always have 2 versus 2. Sometimes two versus one, depending on how the terrorists move, but generally it's 2 versus 2. So I feel like there's potential to design levels differently in a way that it is possible to hold the bomb site with just 2 players, or actually from the other side take the bomb site with just 2 players. And I feel like even though people don't really like the map so much, I think that Short Dust, for example, did a pretty good job at that, where it was a little hectic, or it's a little bit too fast paced. But generally, you had the chance to take the bomb site right from the beginning as a terrorist, plant the bomb, and play from there. And that is something that I was inspired by when designing Guard, where I wanted to have 3 major things. I wanted to have an avenue for the terrorists to quickly get to the bomb site, plant the bomb. I want them to have an avenue where they can gain map control. That's like the backyard area on Guard, where you can push through CT spawn and suddenly have yet another flank onto the bomb site, or push through a choke point and then have a pretty good covered situation, which is along the river, where you can sit in this little pit and have pretty good cover and try to put pressure onto the CTs from there.
So it sounds like a lot of the main things that you were paying attention to when initially designing the map were the approaches to the bomb site itself, rather than worrying too much about the central cover. How did you come up with the design of the bomb site itself? Because that's one where, like, one of the things as a personal pet peeve is when we have a bomb site and there's a bunch of like objects that you can stand on, but you can't plant the bomb in. And one of the things that I think is cool about Guard is that there's that open truck in the middle, and you can plant the bomb inside the truck, or you can plant the bomb outside the truck, and you get a pretty wide berth to plant as a T, which obviously then sets you up for a lot of potential post plant scenarios using all of the different map features that are within that line of sight. One of the main reasons why I think the map in general, but especially that bomb site, seems to have a lot of replay value, just because there's so many angles you can attack from. So how did you go about designing the bomb site itself, given the fact that this is supposed to be a 2v2 game mode?
Yeah, so one of the things that I took into account when designing the bomb site was that I wanted to kind of balance the fact, or the 2 possibilities in a Wingman map or a Wingman match, where you can either plant the bomb and play after plant, or have a deathmatch kind of scenario. I wanted to give both opportunities. That's why the bomb area is fairly large. And concerning the bomb site itself, I came up with this basic idea to I wanted to like add a little bit new kind of cover to Counter-Strike. Like, you always see these boxes and or like large containers and stuff like that, and play around those. And I came up with the idea, why not an open truck? So I opened the sides of the truck, and you could use the base of the truck as a cover. It was a little bit too large, so I restricted some of the side lines with other boxes and these little tarps on the edges. And apart from that, I also gave players the opportunity to jump onto the truck. That's something that's inspired by Cache, which I really like on the A side.
Yes.
Where you can jump onto the red container, which is a tank now, actually, to surprise your enemy on the other side, stuff like that. I really like. And the one last small thing that I would like to mention is that you said that you could plant everywhere, like in this area, especially inside of the truck, which is kind of inspired and kind of an homage to DE Survivor from 1.6.
That's a callback. I'm not sure
Yeah.
too many people will recognize that one. So but that's cool because again, one of the things that I remember singing the praises of when I was doing a review of Mustang back in the day was that there was like, it was a very small thing, but there was a box where it was on the bomb site, you could stand on it and plant the bomb. And it shouldn't be that novel personally. I don't think it's something that is like oh, you're really blowing my mind. But because of the fact that so few bomb sites allow for that sort of thing on any map, especially the ones that are in current release, I think that was a neat way for that map, and obviously also for Guard, to allow a little bit more flexibility. And I think it adds a little bit of tension as well to the overall post-plant scenario, because if you don't know exactly where the bomb is, the fact that it could be so many different places, it sort of accelerates that. And I think that it makes the CTs a little bit more desperate for map control, desperate for vision, so that they can at least get eyes on where the bomb is. Precisely because this is a 2v2 map where it's meant to be an accelerated state of CS. I think it was I don't know how intentional it was, but I think it was a nice way to push the CTs into action a little bit more than maybe they would have been otherwise, because they just need to catch, however many angles they need to be watching out for the Ts, they also need to be figuring out where the bomb is itself. One of the things that I was curious about your take on, and this is a bit more of in terms of game design than level design, but is there something that you've observed with Counter-Strike as a game that, despite the fact that we're obviously using a different max rounds and we're using a bit of a smaller map, generally speaking, an accelerated state in that sense, Wingman mode is fundamentally 2v2, and you are dealing with smaller maps, but there's no other gameplay changes, nor necessarily should there be. But the fact that smokes are still the same size, Molotovs are still the same size, but the map itself can be smaller in certain cases, sometimes leads to, I would say, a potential, at least, for a lot of utility to be even more impactful than it is in the 5v5 game mode. Obviously, you can have less of it, but if it covers more of a ground, relatively speaking, maybe that makes up for it. Are there things like this or other game mechanics that you think maybe lend less well to Wingman than they do to the 5v5 game mode? Are there things that maybe you would look into adjusting for the Wingman game mode versus the 5v5 game mode?
I thought about that, actually. Something I encountered while designing Guard is that even the bomb sites are fairly small. If you want to cover something up, you need at least 2 smokes. You only have 2 players, so you need to keep all of your smokes throughout the entire round to play that hit that you initially planned. So something I would like to experiment with is having different loadout restrictions for players. So they could carry maybe 2 smokes, maybe 2 Molotovs. Well, Molotovs might be a little bit much, but generally, I feel like there's a lack of utility that people can use, especially coming back to the original point that bomb sites are usually played 2 versus 3, 4, 5, and not 2 versus 2.
I think that utility limitations in 5v5 even are a little strange, but you've seen the War Owl video where he removed that limit. But for those who have, it's a video where it goes into great detail as to how broken Counter-Strike would be if you could carry like 5 smokes or whatever per player. So it can there's a reason for it, presumably, but I think it's an interesting question to explore. And I think one of the things that you'll get, generally speaking, in a lot of these games that have lasted as long as Counter-Strike as a game across all of its different iterations has lasted, is that sometimes people will get caught into a similar cycle when it comes to thinking about the game, conceptualizing about the game. And I mean, no greater evidence of this, in my opinion, was when we saw so many pros not using the Krieg and the AUG until their prices were dropped just a little bit, and suddenly they took over the entire scene. So I was going to ask about generally like your thoughts on Counter-Strike's balance as it currently stands. I mean, we've exited the Krieg meta, we've exited the AUG meta, but had those things stayed the same, had those things still remained very powerful weapons in the professional environment, do you think that would have impacted level design at all? Like, would you have taken to designing certain map areas a little bit differently to either promote or punish that kind of play using those scoped rifles, or do you think that there would have been any impact, more broadly speaking?
I can see it. Yes, I can see scenarios where, where if the creek stayed or the arc stayed the way that they were, that people used it as like a budget op, which is true because like you had these one shot potentials with the creek as well, especially on a pro level. So I guess one way to counter that in terms of map design would be to facilitate utility usage. Something that I find very interesting is what Astralis did a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago, maybe even 2 years ago, where they introduced these heavy nukes into Mirando, for example. I think stuff like that would be more important, like smoking off a certain area and then throw nades through that in order to get those people out of their positions. So to precisely answer your question, I think that utility would be, or like facilitating utility usage through map design would be one way to tackle it if it stayed the same. Gladly it didn't.
Yeah, thankfully. So I was going to then move on to talk about your personal favorite community map that has come out. And we can say that number 1 is Feast, number 2 is Guard or whatever, but other than your own work, right? What do you think some of the best maps that have come out of the community lately, either for one of the contests or just in general, have been, in your opinion?
I do think Anubis is a very good map. I do think Anubis absolutely deserves being in the matchmaking rotation. Apart from that, I like a lot of maps, but to be honest, I've rarely played them 5 versus 5 in like a team setting, stuff like that. So that brings a completely different dynamic into it. But apart from that, Anubis, I really like the gameplay of Basalt. Dear favorite of mine. Yeah, unfortunately, there are a couple of maps that I really like that never got out of the gray box version yet. So it's like it's a little bit sad. Yeah, but apart from that, I think that all of the maps that made it to the client are well deserved there. Even if I said like I didn't like the mechanic of Swamp, for example, I still think it's a good map. It was just a personal pet peeve that I don't like punishing the player for moving somewhere. I would rather reward them by choosing a different path.
I've got to ask you then the question that is a logical or extension of that last one is best your favorite map that has been officially added to the game. So like, cache or anything like that that's in the full map pool. What do you think that qualifies as the number 1 in that particular environment for you?
In the professional,
in the
professional circuit,
in the professional circuit currently.
Well, for me, it's a map that I have always liked since 1.6, and that's Inferno. I really enjoy that map since it's so utility based, and it has like a unique dynamic that no other map has, where you could sit for a while and then suddenly explode onto the bomb site. I really enjoy this dynamic. I kind of tried to do something similar with Feast, actually. Feast was heavily inspired by Inferno and also Mirage in terms of the design philosophies. But yeah, I also really enjoy Train, which is weird because most people don't like it too much. But I like how players have a lot of choices to make, where like they can sit on top of the train, they can sit off either side of the trains, and can move around a lot. I really enjoy it personally, with all the player potential that it has.
Cool. I have to say that when I look at Train, it's like me personally, just the sheer number of, like you say, choices you can take to elevate your z-axis, elevate your position, your height, as well as to move back and forth like we do in every other map. That's one of those cases where, like you were talking earlier about Vertigo being known as the map where you can fall off. Well, Train's the map where you can climb pretty much everything. So yeah, it's a nice defining characteristic of the map. I wanted to ask next about ways that Valve could continue to improve the maps that we currently have in the pool, since I would ask the age-old question that a lot of people have asked before, which is, what maps do you think Valve would put into the community pool or the full competitive pool? What maps, like, what could Valve do differently about that? But it doesn't seem to be their MO. I mean, at this point, it's been a long time since a community-made map has come into the pool. So just basically looking at the existing maps that we have, are there certain maps that you think are not pulling their weight, they're not as good as they could be, or strategies that you think Valve level designers could employ to improve the overall construction of some of the maps in ways that might help breathe some new life into them and change things up in a positive way?
I feel like all of the maps that are in the pool right now are fairly solid. Maybe it's maybe a little bit too early for judgment on Vertigo, but generally, every map that's in the map pool has its own characteristics, and there's this weird idea that some people come up with every now and then, which is season-based, change bomb sites on maps, but nothing else, and try to breathe in new life with that. I don't think that is a solution at all, because most of the dynamic from a map is not dictated by the bomb site itself, but by the choke points leading up to the bomb site. So effectively, it would only change the actual gunfight around the bomb or on the bomb site, including mostly after-plan scenarios.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a big pet peeve of mine as well. Like it's been circulated by a lot of people that's a potential solution. So
I don't agree with it. And it also only, so one of the reasons why there are not coming new maps all the time into the competitive circuit is that players have to learn those maps. And as someone who myself played competitively for a while, I can understand that. It's hard to learn smokes, flashes, Molotovs for each map and each scenario. So that's a lot to learn. But you would have to learn again if the bomb site changed. Like, a lot of the utility is based on where could a CT stand and how do you want to flush them out, or which line of sight do you want to block with your smoke and stuff like that. So that would be needed to learn anyway.
Right. So it's an imperfect solution if what they're trying to do is not only keep the same maps, but also allow professional players to like meaningfully change the battlegrounds that they're fighting over without changing the skills they have to learn, or the certain things like that. Like you're saying, it doesn't seem to fully it doesn't seem to fully solve the problem. It introduces it on a smaller level than an entirely new map. But at the same time, like, why go for a budget solution when a full measure exists, right? So given that's the situation, out of the community maps that we currently have in the I think it's scrimmage mode is what they're calling it now, and stuff like that. Like, we've seen, obviously, Chlorine, Swamp, and Anubis come through. If you had to pick a map that was going to go out of the current competitive ladder pool, and then you also had to pick a map that was going to go in from one of those three maps that exists, or maybe Cache as well, since that's been in limbo for a little bit, which map would you actually want to see reintroduced the most?
From the ones that has been in the competitive pool already?
Oh, sorry. From which community map would you want to see out of those ones, the ones that have been recently added? So Anubis, Chlorine, Swamp. Cache was also recently remade, but has not been officially added, so that could be another option. but those are the maps that we know Valve has some interest in because they've been added in some way or another to the unofficial map pool. So out of those 4 options, which would you want in, and which map would you be taking out to replace it with?
So generally, taking a map out, I would personally go for either Mirage or Dust 2, since those two, they're great maps both, but I think they're very similar. And I think Cache is also one of those where it's played very similarly. And I feel like there could be more diversity within the map pool. Like Overpass is very unique with the connector play instead of the straight mid, like most other levels do or other maps do. Nuke and Vertigo bring their verticality. Inferno has the B bomb side, which is unique because it only has one entry point for Ts, stuff like that. So I feel like there could be a different kind of map or type of map introduced into the map pool. And from the most recent ones, I think Swamp will be one that's reasonable because it is fairly different. I said before that I like Anubis very much, but I also feel like it's very straightforward and very similar to maps like Mirage or Dust 2, where you have this long sideline mid and then flanking routes on each bomb side.
All right. Well, I think that covers all the questions I had personally prepared. I was curious if you had any particular final thoughts or final message to send to people. I'll, of course, have all of the maps that you've recently been putting together in the description for people to check out. But I don't know if you want to say anything about the Wingman contest that's been going on. We didn't fully talk about the specifics of that. So if you wanted to get into details about that, that would be cool. Otherwise, any final words? Any final thoughts?
Well, I would just highly encourage people to check out the maps that are coming out of the Wingman contest. Even if you feel like you're not really playing Wingman so much, you're more of a 5 versus 5 guy, just take a look and see what crazy concepts some of the people came up with. It's pretty cool.
All right. Thanks for your time, man.
Thank you too.